This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zachariason.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zachariason, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 338 of the Late Round Podcast, one of many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. I have a list that I use for potential Late Round Podcast topics for the offseason, but the list isn't just filled with bulleted items to cover. It's filled with questions. They're questions that I want to dive into for offseason shows just like this one. One of the questions on the sheet for this offseason says, are wide receivers dying? Clearly, I'm not being very thoughtful with how I phrase these questions, but the idea behind this one was, is the edge from the top group of wide receivers fading? We know Michael Thomas dominated this year, and he gave fantasy managers a significant edge. I'm not just talking about him here. Clearly, he was massively important. I just mean as a whole. I mean by looking at top wide receivers, is their benefit from a fantasy points scored standpoint not as significant as it used to be? This entire question was built on intrigue, which is the case for most of the questions that I try to answer during the offseason. This year, it just felt like there was a little bit more parity with the wide receiver position. And I don't mean looking at preseason average draft position and postseason results. I just mean that throughout the fantasy season, there didn't seem to be many wide receivers who were consistently giving you a huge edge over the competition, with the exception of Michael Thomas. So in looking at this question, I did what I do every single year at the end of the season. I look at the positional breakdowns for things like target share, receiving yard share, touchdown share, and I compare those numbers to what we've seen in the past. You guys might remember a show at the start of last offseason where I ran through a similar exercise, and I talked about how running backs were being involved more in the passing game, and how that impacted fantasy football. I'll be looking at similar numbers today. That's where I started when trying to answer this question. Now, before looking at those numbers, I want to let you guys know that to celebrate the start of 2020, FanDuel is offering a 2020 bonus in every January featured NBA shot contest. Just roster a player who records a 2020 game and win a share of $20,000. For more details, visit FanDuel.com/NBA or download the FanDuel app today. Eligibility restrictions apply. So let's look at some of this data to kick things off. We'll start with targets. In 2019, wide receivers accounted for 58.4% of the NFL's targets. And these are wide receivers based on their positional eligibility. That number was just slightly below 2018, which was well above what we saw in 2017. As a whole, since 2011, wide receivers are getting a little less of the target pie across the league, but it's not overly significant. The real difference in target share across the three positions is at running back and tight end. Running backs did see a drop in target share this past year, but over the last 3 seasons, they've averaged 21.1% of the NFL's targets. Tight ends have seen 20.5% over the last 3 years. Compare that to 2011 to 2013, so a 3-year span earlier in the decade, running backs had a target share that was 2 percentage points lower. Tight end was over a percentage point higher. But since we're worried about top wide receivers, the overall landscape doesn't necessarily tell us a ton. Wide receivers as a position could be seeing the same type of volume, but that volume may be spread out more than it used to be, meaning the top receivers aren't giving you much of an edge in target share. So let's look into that. In 2019, the top 5 wide receivers in fantasy football accounted for 7.5% of all wide receiver targets. The average from 2011 to 2015 was 7.9%. So yeah, this year saw a slight drop, but again, it wasn't significant. Top 10 wide receivers saw 14.4% of wide receiver targets. During the first portion of the decade, that number was 14.8%. So again, maybe we're seeing a slight dip, but it's not glaring to the point where we'd say elite wide receivers are dying off. Now, in some, targets have dropped for top 10 wide receivers through the years. And for the record, I'm going to be referencing things like top 10 wide receivers throughout today's show, and I'm fully aware that it's an arbitrary way of doing things. I'm only looking at this from a high level to see if there are any general trends that exist in order to dig deeper and investigate further. So to all you arbitrary cutoff haters, I feel you. But what we may be feeling a little bit from a target standpoint with wide receivers is that top wide receivers have seen a drop in overall targets since 2011, which is when the NFL really started to become a more pass-heavy league. From 2011 through 2015, for example, the top 10 fantasy wide receivers averaged 1,542 targets per season, 1,542 targets. Over the last 4, that's dropped by 61 per season, or over 6 targets per receiver. The thing is, though, that's happening at every level. Wide receivers ranked 11th through 20th have also seen a drop, as have the next 10 wide receivers. It's really just the target shares have shifted a little bit, and that's caused slightly lower volume output for wide receivers overall. So essentially, to make this all a little bit cleaner, yes, volume is down at wide receiver. It's not overly significant, but it's down. But the question we're trying to answer is, are top wide receivers dying? When looking at that from a volume perspective, there's a slight trend in the wrong direction for these top wideouts. Their target shares are a little bit lower. Looking at individual wide receivers helps show this a little bit too. Back in 2011, 2 wide receivers had a target share at or above 30%. The next year, there were also 2. And then 4. And then 3. And then 3 again. So from 2011 through 2015, an average of 2.8 wide receivers per season had target shares at or above 30%. That's always considered an elite tier. Since then, we've had 1 per season. Only 1 wide receiver each year has hit a 30% target share. Having that wide receiver has given you a nice edge in fantasy football, but they've become rarer, meaning hitting on that player in your draft becomes more difficult. Players with a 25% target share have dropped too. From 2011 to 2015, we averaged 11.4 per season. Since then, it's been 9.5. And 20% target share or higher players have dropped as well. It's gone from 28 per season at the wide receiver position for the first half of the decade to 24. And this is all compounded by a really, really interesting trend in touchdowns. This past season, 16.4% of all wide receiver touchdowns were scored by top 10 wide receivers in fantasy football. We had 79 of them among the players who finished in the top 10. That 16.4% number is the second lowest that we've seen since 2011. The only time it was lower was in 2017 at 16%. That means 2 of the lowest touchdown share seasons among top 10 wide receivers over the last decade have come over the last 3 years. And it's been a pretty significant difference. We're talking about a 16% touchdown share for 2017 and 2019, when the other seasons that we're analyzing here, so the other 7 since 2011, the top 10 wide receivers during those seasons have averaged a 20% touchdown share. They've seen 20% of all wide receiver touchdowns. And what's even more interesting is that this had sort of a trickle-down effect, especially with lower-end wide receiver 2s and higher-end wide receiver 3s. Now, let me walk through this in a pretty detailed way so that it's not confusing. I know listening to this stuff can be hard sometimes because you're not able to actually see these numbers, but hear me out. I just went through the touchdown share numbers for wide receivers ranked in the top 10 at the position since 2011, or the percentage of wide receiver touchdowns scored. As I just talked about, the 2019 season saw top 10 wide receivers score a little bit over 16% of all wide receiver touchdowns, and that was low. Now, if we do that exercise for the next 10 wide receivers and the 10 after that, we can start to show replaceability, at least when it comes to touchdowns. If players in the next groups of 10 are scoring at a similar rate as the top 10 receivers are, then that means that the top 10 wide receivers are giving you less of an edge. In 2019, the wide receivers ranked 11th through 30th scored 26% of all wide receiver touchdowns. That subset of wide receivers had a wide receiver touchdown share that was 9.6% higher than the top 10 wide receivers this past year. Because top 10 wide receivers last year had a 16.4% wide receiver touchdown share, and this next group had a 26% share. The difference between the two is 9.6%. Now, if you do that exercise for each season since 2011, you find that 2019, 2017, and 2012 had the highest difference between top 10 wide receiver touchdown share versus the touchdown share for the next 20 wide receivers in fantasy football. In other words, those top 10 wide receivers weren't providing that significant of an edge. And it's really not close. When you look at every other season, top 10 wide receivers were scoring touchdowns at a much, much higher rate. And what's interesting about the 2012 season that I just referenced, a lot of the reason top 10 wideouts weren't giving you much of an edge is because the next 10 wide receivers scored a lot of touchdowns. It was sort of an outlier year for that group. Really, wide receivers ranked 21st to 30th didn't do all that well, at least in 2012. But in 2019 and 2017, we had the 2 best seasons in touchdown share among wideouts ranked 21st to 30th. What that tells us is that the players who are your lower end wide receiver 2 or your higher end wide receiver 3, they're scoring touchdowns at a higher rate than we've ever seen, at least over the last decade. And that makes top wide receivers less significant and important. Touchdowns correlate to volume. The more volume a player has, the more we should expect him to score. So it's not surprising that a slight dip in volume for top receivers then also results in a slight dip in touchdown share. Now, of course, you could do the same exercise by looking at raw fantasy points. And unsurprisingly, given everything that I just talked about, wide receivers ranked 11th to 30th were closest to the top 10 wide receivers this past year than they have been since 2011, and potentially beyond. I just didn't look past 2011. So overall, the point here is that top wide receivers kind of sucked in 2019. It's a broad generalization, and this doesn't account for where they were being drafted, which is important. This isn't me saying don't draft wide receivers early next year no matter what, because we're not looking at the accuracy of ADP versus postseason result. We're working with perfect information. But I do think that this is a trend. We've been pretty consistently seeing a wider distribution among targets at the wide receiver position. And when touchdown variance doesn't hit, you get a season like this one. Last year, touchdown variance hit in a positive way. It was great. But we've seen a steady decline in individual players seeing elite target shares. And we've now had 2 down seasons for the position over the last 3 in terms of touchdowns and fantasy points scored, at least in terms of how well the top players separated themselves. The thing is, each year when I do analysis like this, the takeaway is that you should actually do the opposite of what it sounds like I'm suggesting. If there are fewer elite wide receivers, then that makes the actual elite wide receivers really, really good for fantasy purposes. They're unicorns. And this is definitely true. Michael Thomas was a unicorn this year. But like I said before, it's only becoming more and more difficult to find that unicorn. There's a balance that needs to happen and be realized when you're drafting your fantasy team each year. You should strive to get players who are giving you the biggest edges, but you can't ignore number 1, where you'd be getting other usable players at that position in the draft, and then number 2, the actual probability of hitting on that player, the probability of finding that unicorn. And if you look at the wide receiver landscape, it's easy to see that finding that player is becoming increasingly more difficult. And it's also easy to see that there's been a downward trend, albeit not the biggest one in the world, in elite target share and touchdown share. Again, players who hit those high marks are going to give you a nice edge. But we also have an easier fallback plan now with the depth of the position. And you can't find that at running back. Now, we've got months to think about 2020 draft strategy. But I wanted to share the kind of thing that I dig into before really honing in on what I want to do during a draft. It's sort of a foundation. It's information that I've got in the back of my head now when I'm researching other topics. And hopefully that information will help you too. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. I'll talk to you on Friday with the weekly mailbag show.